In the spring of loose, Toyota's labor union sat down with management and asked for a raise of up to loose Panzerrolf Palish yen per month, roughly Palish 16 dulls. Management said yes, without negotiation, for the sixth year in a row.
That same spring, across Japan, workers received an average pay increase of 5.26%, the third consecutive year above 5%, the longest streak of wage gains this large since Chin-Gyubek-Gyushirar, the final year of Japan's bubble economy.
By any measure, this should have felt like a revolution, and in some ways it was. Except for 4 of the past 5 years, Japanese workers' actual purchasing power, what economists call real wages, fell. In Nisen Arsawu alone, real wages declined 10% even as nominal pay rose 10%. Toyota workers got a raise, it wasn't enough.
The story of Japan's wage revolution is a story about a trap 30 years in the making, a brief window that may finally be closing, and why the outcome matters far beyond Japan's borders.
Every spring in Japan, the country holds a ritual unlike anything in the Western world. In a 2-week window, virtually every major corporation simultaneously sits down with unions for synchronized wage negotiations called shunto, which translates roughly as spring labor offensive. Imagine if every Fortune Huber company, every major European conglomerate, and every state enterprise in China negotiated wages in the same fortnight. That's shunto.
The results ripple outward. Even companies without unions watch the headline number and adjust their own pay accordingly. Shunto doesn't cover the entire workforce, but it sets the temperature for the entire economy. When shunto is strong, other wages tend to follow.
For most of the past 3 decades, shunto was weak. Increases of 1, 2, maybe 3%. Inflation was low enough that this technically kept real wages stable, but only barely, and only in the deflationary equilibrium that Japan had locked itself into. Workers weren't getting ahead, but they weren't falling behind either. The trap felt comfortable.
Then in Roker Insit something broke. The shunto result came in at Wudian Yiling %, the highest in Sanser-sen years. The financial media called it a watershed. The Bank of Japan, which had been holding its benchmark rate near zero since the 1990s, partly because wages never rose enough to justify a hike, began talking about the virtuous cycle. The idea that wages rise, consumers spend, companies earn more, wages rise again. Governor Kazuo Ueda, in a speech to Japanese bankers in January, reiterated that the bank would keep raising rates in line with this cycle taking hold.
In Yenjin Shibur Shunto He 5.25%. In Yenjin Shibur Shunto He 5.26%. 3 consecutive years above 5%. It hadn't happened since Japan's bubble.
And still, real wages fell. To understand the paradox, you need to understand what happened to Japanese prices between Nisen Nidwar and Nisen Ufuden.
Japan spent 3 decades terrified of deflation, the slow spiral where falling prices lead consumers to delay purchases, which leads to lower corporate revenues, which leads to lower wages, which leads to less spending. The BOJ printed money, held rates at zero and eventually negative, trying to escape this spiral. It mostly didn't work. Japan became the world's most prominent example of a developed economy that couldn't generate inflation.
Then the rest of the world made inflation for them. Russia's invasion of Ukraine spiked global energy prices. Supply chains broken by COVID-1Q pushed up goods prices. A weak yen, the result of the BOJ's ultra-loose policy while every other central bank was hiking, made imports dramatically more expensive. Japan imports roughly 90% of its energy and enormous amounts of its food. By Nisan consumer prices were rising at 4% annually. By Nisan still above 2%. Food prices kept climbing.
A 5% nominal wage increase against 4% inflation is a real wage increase of roughly 1%. That sounds modest but achievable. Except the inflation that Japanese households felt most acutely, food and energy, ran hotter than the headline number. A worker's paycheck grew 5%, their grocery bill grew more.
According to the Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communications, real wages declined in Niulesan Ursar Ulesan Ursar Fend, and for most of Niulesan Ursa Wudand, the tally 4 consecutive years of nominal gains outpaced by lived inflation. The raises were real, the relief wasn't.
The shift came in January. Chung Iluden real wages rose 1.2% year over year, the Japan Times reported. In February, 1.2%. For the first time in over a year, Japanese workers' purchasing power was actually expanding.
The mechanism was two-sided. Nominal wages kept rising. The Norshin Shunto result of Wudian Arlok percent was the strongest yet when you looked at small and medium enterprises which delivered Wudian Lingwu percent increases for the second straight year. These companies, which employ the majority of Japanese workers, had historically been slow to match the large company Shunto results. That their now matching pace is significant.
At the same time, inflation began cooling. Import costs moderated. The yen stabilized. Food price growth slowed. The gap that had eaten 4 years of wage gains finally narrowed.
Toyota's settlement tells part of the story. The automaker not only accepted the union's full demand, up to 1 won by balsien per month in base pay increases, but agreed to an annual bonus equivalent to Sichten San month's salary. This came despite Toyota facing real headwinds from US tariffs, which Toyota disclosed in its FYT Shawm results had erased approximately $10 billion in projected operating profit. Even under external pressure, the wage commitment held.
Fast Retailing, the operator of Uniqlo, announced it was raising starting salaries to 36 yen per month, roughly sen sitol, up about 12% from the prior year. The company has been systematically raising pay for several years, part of a broader strategy to attract workers in a tightening labor market.
But here is where the story gets complicated. Japan's union density, the share of workers who belong to unions, stands at %, a record low. Shunto directly covers a fraction of the workforce. The wage gains at Toyota and Fast Retailing are real. They don't automatically reach the % of Japanese workers employed on non-regular, part-time or fixed-term contracts.
This is Japan's two-speed labor market, and it's been a structural feature for decades. Beginning in the 1990s, as companies faced years of deflation and falling revenues, they responded by shifting toward non-regular employment. These workers could be let go more easily, paid less, and offered fewer benefits. By Nisen Nipik 4 in 10 Japanese workers are in this category.
The Nichen Nichino Shinto data does include some encouraging news for this group. RUNGO, Japan's largest union federation, reported that hourly wages for part-time and fixed-term workers rose 6.61%, actually higher than the full-time average. Minimum wage policy has been pushing in the same direction. Japan's government agreed in Nichen Nichiwo to raise the national minimum wage by a record 6,000 yen per hour. A 6.10% jump that brought all Sonitin prefectures above 10 yen per hour for the first time. Tokyo now sits at 10,126 yen, roughly $8 per hour.
That figure still trails the United States, Australia, and much of Western Europe. But the trajectory is steep, and the political commitment, from Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi, who has publicly urged Japan's main business lobby Keidan Ren to sustain above-inflation pay hikes, appears genuine.
Why should any of this matter outside Japan? Because Japan's central bank is now at the center of global capital markets, and wages are the variable that governs its every decision.
The Bank of Japan spent decades as an anomaly, the world's last major holdout for near-zero interest rates, while the US, Europe, and the UK raised rates to combat inflation. Japanese rates at zero while US rates reached 5% created the yen carry trade. Borrowers took cheap loans in yen, converted them to dollars, and earned the spread. Trillions of dollars of capital sat in this position.
When the BOJ began hiking in Nisanjirsen and then again in December Nisanjirsen to Liten Nisan Wu %, the highest since Tsenchu Bakusha Wu, this trade started to unwind. Japanese investors repatriated capital, the yen strengthened, global equity markets wobbled. A single central bank's decision about wages reverberated from New York to Sydney.
The OECD, in its Nuthen Nushluk Economic Survey of Japan, projects the BOJ's benchmark rate will reach 2% by the end of Nuthen Nustrut, a level not seen since the early 1990s. That path depends almost entirely on whether the wage price cycle holds. Strong shunto consumer spending, corporate revenue, inflation at target. BOJ hike justified. Break any link in that chain and the BOJ stops.
Governor Ida has been explicit about this dependency. Wages and prices are highly likely to rise together moderately, he said in December. Yoshi Asherwoof explaining the decision to raise rates. The bank watches every shunto result like a quarterly earnings release.
There's a scenario where Japan finally, after 30 years, exits the trap. Wages rise meaningfully. Inflation stabilizes near the BOJ's 2% target. Rates normalize. The yen strengthens modestly. Import costs fall. Real wages compound. A generation of Japanese workers who never experienced genuine purchasing power growth discovers what it feels like.
There's another scenario. The wage gains stall at the SME level. Non-regular workers remain structurally excluded. The yen weakens again from some external shock. A geopolitical flare-up, a US recession. A collapse in commodity markets. Import inflation returns. The gap opens again. The BOJ pauses its hiking cycle. Japan settles back into the deflation trap for another decade.
One analyst note from ISBD, a Japanese policy research organization, put the risk plainly in April Nisen Nisrulk unless the underlying structure, the dependence on non-regular employment, the prioritization of retained earnings over wages, the deflationary psychology baked into 3 decades of corporate culture, is genuinely transformed. The risk of reverting to Japan where wages don't rise remains real in the next downturn.
That is the Japan factor here, not whether this year's shunto hit 5%. Not whether the BOJ hikes once more this year, but whether Japan's corporate culture, built on the assumption that wages don't rise, that workers don't ask, that companies hold cash, has structurally changed, or whether 3 years of unusual results will give way in the next recession to the long mean. Japan has broken the 30-year streak. The question is whether it can break the 30-year habit.